Hello. So our subject for this talk is the extermination camps, or the death camps that were created the latter part of 1941 and 1942, the process of creating them and what Jews experienced in those camps. And what I would like to do to begin this talk, I'm going to share a screen, is first of all to go back and remind us of some of the things that we've already discussed in this series that will lead into what I would like to share with you. And to do that, I'm going to share a screen. And I'm starting with just a reference to two documents that have probably already been discussed here. One is this letter from Hermann Goering to Reinhard Heydrich, July 31st, 1941, that was actually initiated by Adolf Eichmann and Heydrich in order to get for Heydrich the authority that he needed to proceed with all sorts of ideas that they were discussing. And as we know in this document, Goering told Heydrich, as he says in the last sentence, "I further charge you with submitting to me promptly an overall plan of the preliminary organizational, practical, and financial measures for the execution of the intended final solution of the Jewish question." And as we know, most historians agree that what this was an order from Goering to Reinhard Heydrich to prepare a feasibility study for how might they go about performing or carrying out this final solution were they to decide to do it. We know that Heydrich did the research. You already have traced all of that history. And then at the Wannsee conference, the meeting of executives to discuss how to coordinate the implementation of this final solution that they were embarking on in Nazi Germany, the Secretary General, the senior civil servant in the German Generalgouvernement, the general government of occupied Poland, that, as you know, included the Warsaw area, the Krakow area, the Lublin area, and more, Josef Biller, in the last comment in the minutes of that conference, asked that, on the one hand, the general government be the first place where this final solution would be implemented. And he also promised, and here we have in the last part of what's on the screen, he committed the civilian government, the German civilian government, or the general government, to assist and join with the SS and the security police and the SD, all the authorities of the SS and the police, in carrying out this final solution in the general government. And as we know, the cooperation between the civilian authorities in the general government and the SS and police during that period of preparing the murder of the Jews and then carrying it out was actually very close, contrary to a lot of the earlier rivalries that had existed between these two bodies in that area. When it came to murdering the Jews, they worked very closely hand in hand together. Now, I want to relate to some of the background of the creation of camps and how they developed into those camps that were the death camps. And we're talking about a group of camps that used mainly different kinds of gassing methods as the way to kill the Jews. And these methods, as you know, continued as they were being developed and became a major method of murdering Jews. They operated in parallel to the ongoing shootings of the Jews that were taking place in the Soviet Union, in Romania, and of course in Poland itself. First, Auschwitz-Birkenau. As we know, Auschwitz began as a concentration camp and a penal camp that was meant for Polish underground people. And the first Polish people who were sent to this camp that was built on a former military base. It had been an Austrian base in World War I, and then it became a Polish infantry base in the interwar period, and now the Germans had taken it over and turned it into a concentration camp. The first Polish prisoners sent there were 728 prisoners, underground people, sent there in June of 1940. Among those 728 were approximately 20 Jews as well who were active in Polish underground organizations, but that's what it was meant for primarily. The main shift in Auschwitz that we see began to take place already in the spring of 1941, prior to the decision and the implementation of the final solution. When Heinrich Himmler, the head of the SS, saw an opportunity to expand Auschwitz into the area that we know of as Auschwitz II, Birkenau, to take over land, take over farms from local Polish villagers and farmers, evict those villagers, and then build additional camps where the industrial complexes of Germany, such as IG Farben, would be able to build large factories. The SS would provide endless numbers of forced laborers, meaning Jews, that they would provide for IG Farben. And if the Jews would die in the course of the labor, there will always be more Jews. This is how Himmler negotiated with IG Farben. He convinced IG Farben and other large companies and conglomerates to investigate the possibilities. And by the fall of 1941, the Polish villagers and farmers were already being evicted, and clearing the ground and beginning to build Birkenau was happening already by the end of 1941. Parallel to that, we know that Rudolf Höss, the commandant of Auschwitz, when he was captured after World War II and first testified in pretrial interrogations in Nuremberg, and then at the Nuremberg trial itself, before he was extradited to Poland, where he stood trial and was convicted and executed, Hess, in his testimony in Germany several times, repeated the same story, that Himmler summoned him and he met Himmler in the summer, and Himmler told him about the final solution and told him that he needs to begin preparing Auschwitz for this new job, because Auschwitz would become ultimately the main center for killing the Jews of Europe. What it turned out was, of course, that Auschwitz was the main center for killing the Jews outside of Poland, Jews from other countries. They also ended up killing many Jews from Poland in Auschwitz, perhaps as many as 300,000. But additional Jews, and the main Jews who were killed in Auschwitz were Jews from outside of Poland. Now, there's a problem with Hess's testimony. It's not always clear in the way he tells the story if this meeting with Himmler was something that happened in the summer of 1941, or the meeting that we know happened in the summer of 1942, when new and large gas chamber and crematoria complexes, the ones that we know of, whoever went to visit Birkenau and saw the ruins of these complexes, these were decided on and planned in July of 1942, not 41. There were already gas chambers by that time. But the large ones that could each hold between 1,500 and 2,000 people at once and kill that number of people in one blow, those were discussed and then began to be planned and later built beginning in the July of 1942. So which meeting was he talking about is not entirely clear. But what is clear is that the first experimental gassing using this agricultural pesticide that was being produced by a subsidiary of IG Farben, the Degesh factory, the pesticide called Zyklon B was used already in early September of 1941 in an experimental gassing where the victims were several hundred Soviet prisoners of war brought in, and they were killed in Auschwitz. It took a long time to kill them, 24 hours, but the experiment was deemed a success because the reason it took a long time was that there were too many air holes and they didn't squeeze these prisoners into a room in a tight enough space, so there was too much air. But it was deemed a success, and we already have the first blueprint for the first gas chamber to be built at Auschwitz that was going to use this method of murder, Zyklon B, already October 15th of 1941. There's already a blueprint to build such a gas chamber. So that's the beginning of the development of Auschwitz, expanding the camp, and ultimately Birkenau became the main murder center. And in addition to that, parallel to that, developing the gassing method that was the method for most of the murder at Auschwitz and Birkenau that took place. Parallel to that, in the latter part of August of 1941, in part in order to relieve some of the pressure on those engaging in the shooting murders in the Soviet Union, as you know, Walter Rauch, an SS lieutenant colonel, was given the job of coordinating, looking into gassing people with some kind of a gas vehicle. There were experimental gassings using engine exhaust in Mogilev. There were experimental gassings in other places. There were companies who were invited, automobile companies were invited to submit ideas and develop models of how they would develop a gas van. Finally, in October of 1941, they had the proper vehicle developed. There were experimental gassings using that vehicle. And then a decision was taken in the SS to begin to build the first camp that would be using this method of murder, gas vehicles. And that, of course, is the camp of Chelmno. Construction of Chelmno began around November the 1st of 1941. And because it was a simple camp, there was no complicated structure to build, the camp was ready to go using these gas vehicles by December the 8th of 1941. As we know, the Wannsee Conference was originally scheduled to begin to meet on December the 9th because of the U.S. entered the war following Pearl Harbor. The attack on Pearl Harbor on December 7th, the meeting was postponed. We don't know for sure if opening Chelmno and scheduling Wannsee the day after had any connection or if that was a coincidence. But looking back, it certainly is an ominous coincidence. So Chelmno began operating and murdering people from the Wartegau, the annexed areas of Poland, already on December the 8th of 1941. And recent research in Yad Vashem that has not yet been published, but will soon be published, has found that actually the first gassing murders at Chelmno of Jews from the Lodz ghetto began not on December 8th, but maybe 4 or 5 days earlier. And then we have the development of the camps that we know of, or came to be known as part of Operation Reinhard. And Odilo Globochnik, the SS general who was the commander of the SS and police forces in the Lublin District from early in the occupation in 1939, began to look into developing murder methods and a whole murder operation even before he was given such an assignment. He did a number of things all parallel to each other. First, in July of 1941, he sent out some of his trusted officers to the new prisoner of war camps that were created for Soviet prisoners of war following the beginning of Operation Barbarossa. As we know, millions of Soviet prisoners of war fell into German hands in the first half year of the war, and most of them in that first period were murdered by the Germans. And Globochnik saw an opportunity to build a private army that could carry out any special job he might want to do. So he sent some of his trusted officers to the prisoner of war camps that were not that far from Lublin, that is, either inside of the general government in the Lublin district or just over the border in what had been the Soviet Union, but was not that far. And he asked these officers to interview prisoners of war, and try to identify not just people who would like to get out of the prisoner of war camp and maybe save their lives, but people who really identified with Germany against the Soviet Union and against Jews and would really be good partners for Germany. The first such group of Travniki men, that is, people who were trained in a special training camp in Travniki, were there already no later than July the 9th of 1941. 200 Red Army soldiers who switched sides, all of whom, these first 200, were ethnic Germans. That is, their ancestors had moved to Russia somewhere in the 18th century. They're the subsequent generations, but because the Germans saw them as ethnic Germans, they were the first ones trained. They then became the drill sergeants for the later groups that came to be trained. Between that point, July 1941, and May of 1943, nearly 2 years, around 5,000 such men were trained at Travniki, and nearly all of them, I would say all of them, but I don't know about every single one, so nearly all of them, as far as we know, ended up playing a role in murdering the Jews in Poland, whether in roundups or in shootings or in the camps themselves that were run by Globocnik. In July of 1941, Heinrich Himmler, Globocnik's boss, also visited Globocnik. He really liked Globocnik. And whenever Himmler traveled east-west, he always would stop in Lublin for a couple of days because he wanted to spend time with Globocnik. And apparently Globocnik was very good at organizing entertainment and drinking parties and prostitutes for the officers who came to visit. So everyone wants to visit Globocnik. And when Himmler was there, we know that they had several meetings. And we have two documents that give us some definite information of jobs that Himmler gave Globocnik. One of them was to build a new camp that was going to be initially a prisoner of war camp, but quickly was expanded in its job and what it was supposed to do, to be a camp for all sorts of underground people. And then in 1942, also to be a camp that would be part of Globocnik's planning for what he's going to do with Jews. That is the camp that we know of as Majdanek. At the time, it was simply called the Lublin camp, but it's the Majdanek camp that we're talking about, and it was Globocnik who was responsible for building it and having some kind of a role in running it. In addition to that, Globocnik got another job to plan out somewhere in the newly conquered territories of the Soviet Union, somewhere where the new eastern border of Germany would be. And they would build, the idea was that they would build a whole belt of SS and police garrison towns, towns where the SS and policemen would live with their families, and these would be like fortress towns and the new eastern border. And this is important because the people that Globocnik sent into the Soviet Union to do this research were officers who took part in the murder of the Jews in the Soviet Union, and then came back to Lublin later in the late fall of 1941. And all of those men doing that research then became senior people in Operation Reinhard. So they had some training as murderers. In the latter part of August of 1941, Globocnik also created a think tank. He called it the SS Mannschaftshaus, like a fraternity. And they were all highly educated, university educated SS men under Globocnik's authority, whose job it was to think out a plan. If we were going to kill Jews here in the general government, how would you do it? And they came up with a plan within a few weeks. They said it to Globocnik, here, if you want to kill people, the way to do it is not to have the murderers chase after the victims and shoot them in these noisy shooting operations, as was being done in the Soviet Union, but rather create some kind of a camp that would be top secret and would be on or near major rail lines to make transport easy, and then deliver the victims to the murderers and then kill them in a secret fashion somehow inside of those camps. But they did not yet know exactly how to kill them. For that, Globocnik turned to the T4 operation, the temporarily suspended euthanasia program, so-called euthanasia, as the Nazis called it, where they killed from early in the war until this point in August of 1941, 70,000 Germans, nearly all of them not Jews. These were people with mental disabilities, handicaps of some sort who were institutionalized, and the Germans decided to kill them. Well, that operation was temporarily suspended. Globocnik asked Himmler, can you loan me some of these people for consultation and later work? And Christian Wirth, one of the security people in that operation, along with a few others, came to visit in September and again later on in 1941, and they gave Globocnik the idea being gas chambers. The main method of murder in Operation T4 had become small gas chambers using carbon monoxide exhaust that was pumped in. And what Christian Wirth told Globocnik is, it's easy. Just turn to the engineers, ask them to build big gas chambers, and we'll get large pumps to pump in lots of gas, and you'll be able to kill whoever you want. Now Globocnik had a plan. He went with the plan to Himmler in October 1941. Himmler gave him the green light, apparently on October the 13th of 1941, to build the first camp that would be part of this new plan. That camp was Belzec. Construction began around November the 1st of 1941, the very same time that the camp at Chelmno was being constructed. So Globocnik now is building Operation Reinhard. He's building manpower, which we already discussed. He has a method of murder. He's planning the sites. The first one is Belzec. He needs to develop cooperation with other authorities, especially the German civilian government. Well, we know that at Wannsee, that was promised by Biller, and he had to prepare the Jews. How do you prepare the Jews and prepare dealing with the Jews' belongings and the property? This slide relates to all of that other, those other aspects I was talking about. And one point I would raise here about the manpower and the cooperation is that the cooperation was going to be, if you look at the last line on the screen, among his special staff that he began creating in the fall of 1941 to carry out the operation of the murder of the Jews of the general government. He called it ultimately Einsatzstab Reinhard, the staff for Operation Reinhard, cooperating with the German civilian government, cooperating with the SS, with the police, using the Polish Blue Police, the railroad authorities, and he needed to cooperate also with Eichmann's office. Eichmann didn't really have a role in Poland except to deliver Jews from other countries. And in that sense, there needed to be coordination and cooperation. So organizing the Germans involved all these things we were just talking about. Organizing the Jews meant that after Wannsee, there was a new census that was going to be taken in every single locality where there were Jews in Poland, and also every other country. But now I'm focusing on Poland in 1942, the first people to be sent to be killed in these camps. A new census taken, with new ID cards being issued to the Jews with a new color stamp, and the stamps would indicate who could be killed right away and who was a necessary laborer. I can tell you that in the general government, the percentage of the Jews who each local civilian authority identified as the essential laborers was less than 10%. In some places, it was only 3 or 4%. In other words, the plan now is, beginning in early 1942, when the new census begins to be taken, kill them all. And the belongings and the property, what do you do with all the Jewish belongings? Well, there too, they had to set up places where Jewish belongings would be sorted. And Jews, some of those left behind as forced laborers, would be the people who were going to sort things. They had to set up standards. What was going to go to Germany of these Jewish belongings, what would be allowed to be given to local people, to Polish people, and what was going to be sold to make money. The Reinhard camps that were built by Globocnik, remember already the development of Chelmno, it's already up and running in December of 41. The development of Auschwitz expanding to Birkenau, the first gas chambers being built already, gassing began there already in the spring of 42. What about these camps, the Operation Reinhard camps? Belzec was ready to run by mid-1942, and a few small transports of Jews from small towns near Belzec, as well as the approximately 250 Jews who were the last people constructing Belzec, that is altogether maybe 1,000 or slightly more than 1,000 victims, were put into the gas chambers in Belzec. in mid-February 1942. The gassing was successful using exhaust from engines, and Globochnik was then told, we're operational, ready when you are. The first deportations to Belzec began from the city of Lublin, where Globochnik was based, on March the 17th of 1942. As the deportations from Belzec began, the second site for one of these camps that was going to use these gas chambers with carbon monoxide was already underway, and that was Sobibor, began to be built in late March, ready to go in late April, and then same here, an experimental gassing in the middle of April, and then it began operating. It was closed temporarily to rail traffic because they had to build new gas chambers, but from October 1942 onwards, they had gas chambers with a capacity of 1,300 a day. And Treblinka, which began to be built in late May or early June, and was ready to run by mid-July of 1942. And with the new gas chambers built there in the summer of 42, by September of 42, their capacity was more than 4,000 at a time that they could kill. We talked about a number of camps. The Chelmno camp had a very, very small staff, because all they needed was people to drive vehicles, guard the vehicles, and then guard the Jewish team that would bury the victims after they were killed. It's a very small staff. But the camps that were real camps, the Reinhard camps and Auschwitz, were very different from each other. They're all killing on a massive scale. But if you look at the staff, the manpower, both German and Jewish, you see that there's a major difference. Where the Operation Reinhard camps were meant for murder and nothing else. A small team of Jewish forced laborers that would sort the goods, deal with the dead bodies, but when they're done, they'll be killed too. And therefore, in a small camp like that, that doesn't have a large number of Jews and doesn't have a large number of work going on, they needed only 20 or 30 SS men, between 80 and 110 of the Travniki men, most of them Ukrainians, in each camp. And each camp, Belzec, Sobibor, Treblinka, would have at any given moment between 500 and 800 Jews working there, and they would be killed and new ones brought in. But Auschwitz-Birkenau was a camp that, once the change began, expanding to Birkenau, had to be a camp with a large staff. And ultimately, Auschwitz-Birkenau had between 6,500 and 7,000 SS men working in all of its branches of that camp. At the peak of the prisoner population, and the overwhelming majority of the prisoners were Jews, it was up to 90,000 prisoners who were there, most of them being used as forced laborers in the various forced labor installations. And therefore, when you look at who commands such a thing, well, if you have 20 to 30 SS and maybe 80 or 100 Ukrainians, you need a lieutenant or a captain. And those are the ranks of the people who were the commanders of the Reinhard camps. But if you have thousands of people, you need a much more senior commander. And Rudolf Hess was lieutenant colonel in the SS, because they're doing more things. They have a much larger staff, many more Jews, many more other prisoners. You need much more senior kind of staff to run that kind of multi-purpose camp. Now, you've already talked about deportations, but just to give an idea of the deportations, which to Chelmno began in December and went on to May of 1942, and then again in September of 42, and then again in early 1944. The deportations to Lublin and the general government in general, the Operation Reinhard camps, received Jews from the general government, but went on to receive Jews from the Third Reich, from the Protectorate, already in 1942, and from Slovakia also, both to Auschwitz and to the Reinhard camps, and from other places. You've talked about it, but these deportations continued to the Reinhard camps through fall 1943, into the beginning of the fall of 1943, to Auschwitz-Birkenau. As we know, Deportations continued into September of 1944. I want to take a look at the deportations, that is, from a Jewish perspective. First of all, a scene. This is a scene of a roundup and a deportation in Lublin, a scene of getting onto the trains in Lublin. And what did that look like to Jews getting on these trains? One of the survivor accounts from a woman named Regina Widawska, who was deported at the end of all of this story. At the liquidation of the Lodz ghetto in August 1944, she was among those who were deported to Auschwitz, and she's one of the few who survived. And she describes that they loaded 70 to 75 people into a small boxcar in intense heat and without a drop of water. The windows were closed, the boxcar sealed. The trains made their way slowly. The journey went on forever. Little children were crying from hunger, thirst, and lack of air. The horrible journey to Auschwitz lasted 4 days. Now, you've already heard from Peter Hayes why these trips took so long, but from the point of view of the people inside the train, that a trip that should have taken maybe an hour or 2 hours took 4 days, gives us an idea of what the people were going through in these overloaded, hot cars with no food and no water and no air. Or this particular note from someone who did not survive. In a deportation from Płonsk and all the towns around Płonsk in central Poland on December 16, 1942 to Auschwitz, someone whose name we don't know because the signature didn't survive, tossed the note out of the train car and wrote, "Please toss the note in the nearest mailbox. It is now morning. We are in the railroad car with the whole family. We're leaving with the last transport. Płonsk has been cleansed of Jews." That is the German term, Judenrein. "Please go to the Baum family at Niska Street, 6 Niska Street," that means in Warsaw, "and send them regards." There were quite a few notes like that were thrown out of trains, and some survived. What was the arrival at the camp like? And here I want to read from the description by Cecily Klein Polak, who arrived in the camp also in 1942. And the photograph is of Hungarian Jews in 1944, but it's evocative of what I want to read here. And she says, "So my brother-in-law asked them," that is the prisoners in striped outfits, "what's going on here?" So he, that is one of the prisoners, of course, didn't answer. So her brother-in-law, had a watch. He goes and he slips him the watch. And then the prisoner tells him, my sister was in the meantime already downstairs, had gotten off the train, and I was sticking next to my mother. So the prisoner he said to her, the prisoner, "Listen, if you have children, give it away to either older people or the women with the children, because women and children and anybody older is going to be killed. They're killing the same night, the same day. There's no chance for these people to survive." And Cecily goes on to tell the story of how her mother overheard this, stepped in, pushed herself in and said, "I'll take the child." And her sister, Cecily's sister, didn't quite understand what's going on, but the mother sacrificed her life to save her daughter's life. And we know of many stories like that, of the scene of the arrival at Auschwitz. What is some of the data we know about all these camps? We know that over all of the period of its existence, Auschwitz-Birkenau killed around 1 million Jews and close to 100,000 other people. Of all of these, there are several thousand survivors. That's a tiny percentage, but that's also one of the reasons that we know more about Auschwitz and about other camps. Treblinka, the latest estimates talk about maybe as many as 900,000 people killed there. But as a result of the revolt there, some survived instead of 0, somewhere between 50 and 100. Belzec, about 500,000 killed and only 1 survivor. There were actually 2, but 1 was murdered by anti-Semites after the war and never got to tell his full story. Sobibor, the estimates now are about 180,000 to 200,000, with about 40 survivors as a result of and escape. And in Chelmno, about maybe 200,000 were killed. We know of 3 survivors. Majdanek, because a lot of the documentation was destroyed in the battles in 1944, it's difficult to get to the numbers. The current estimates run for Majdanek and the sub-camps that it was in charge of to between 89,000 and 110,000 Jews, and maybe an additional 20 or 25,000 other people. One of the important things to understand about these camps is that, except for Majdanek, all the other camps had a regional function. That is, they were meant primarily to kill Jews from a particular area. Belzec, that's Galicia and part of the Lublin District. Sobibor, the Lublin District, and then later Jews from other places. Treblinka, the Warsaw District, the Radom District, and later Jews from other places. Chelmno, the Wartegau. Auschwitz, some of the remaining Polish Jews after they've been killed in the other camps, and all the other Jews from all over the place from other areas. The only camp that finished its job was Belzec. By mid-December 1942, it had killed 500,000 Jews in all the areas that were assigned to Belzec. So Belzec was closed, the bodies were burned, and then the camp was leveled. One of the reasons we know so little about Belzec. There were revolts in 3 camps. In Treblinka, in Sobibor, and in Birkenau. These are the Jewish prisoners engaging in the revolts. Most of the prisoners were killed in both Treblinka and Sobibor. All the prisoners involved in the revolt were killed in Birkenau, except for a couple of the women who weren't directly in the revolt, but were among the women who had smuggled explosives to the Sonderkommando in Birkenau, though the Sonderkommando were the ones who worked in the gas chambers with the victims, with the dead bodies. They're the ones who revolted, and there were women who had been smuggling the explosives to them. A few of them managed to survive, but many of them were killed as well. I want to, as we bring this to a conclusion in a few minutes, I want to take a look inside the camp system from 2 perspectives. First, a German perspective, and then a Jewish perspective. From the German perspective, I want to read a few quotations from the diary of a German physician who was sent to Auschwitz to fill in for a different physician who had become ill and couldn't serve there for a while. So for about 3 or 4 months, Professor Dr. Hans Kremer was at Auschwitz, and he kept a diary. He's a professor of medicine in Germany, in Münster, and he had been a professor of medicine since the 1920s. In other words, he was not someone trained in a medical school under Nazi Germany. He was already a professor before the Nazis came to power. What does he write? September 2nd, 1942, he arrived at the end of August. The first time present at a special action at 3 o'clock in the morning. Compared to this, the Inferno by Dante seems to me as a comedy. Auschwitz is not for nothing called the camp of extermination. So he's horrified by what he sees. It's a camp of extermination. Dante's Inferno is a comedy. September the 5th, 3 days later, this afternoon, present at a special action from the female concentration camp, the most horrible of horrors. Obersturmführer Thilo, the doctor of the troops, is right when he told me this morning that we are at Anus Mundi, the anus of the universe. In the evening at approximately 8 o'clock, again, present at a special action from the Netherlands. The men all want to take part in these actions because of the special rations that they get, consisting of 1/5 of a liter of schnapps, 5 cigarettes, 100 grams of sausage, and bread, today and tomorrow on duty. So you see the shift. And the men, which men? The SS men. They all want to take part in this selection and shoving Jews into a gas chamber because they get schnapps and sausage and cigarettes. Quite an interesting phenomenon. September the 6th, the next day, Sunday, excellent lunch, tomato soup, half a hen with potatoes and red cabbage, sweets and marvelous vanilla ice cream. in the evening at 8 o'clock outside for a special action. So within a few days, September 2nd to September 6th, what in the beginning was the most horrible of horrors and makes Dante's Inferno look to Dr. Kremer like a real comedy. This is so horrible. By September the 6th, the main thing he's writing about is lunch. What a wonderful lunch. Oh, and by the way, in the evening, he's at a special action. He's gotten accustomed to the killing. November the 13th of 1942, he writes living, fresh material of liver, spleen, and pancreas taken from a Jewish prisoner of 18 years of age who was very atrophic. Liver and spleen fixed as usual in Carnoy, pancreas in Zenker, parentheses, prisoner number 68030. What are we looking at? We're looking at his participation in a medical experiment. He had other entries earlier than this about medical experiments that he participated in, but I bring this one here because here we're looking at an experiment done on a prisoner who was still alive, living fresh material. And the prisoner is very atrophic, pasty skin, very sick. They took a photo. When they open him up, they find, well, look at that. A Jewish liver and a Jewish spleen are right where you expect them to be in a normal human being. And who is this prisoner upon whom they're performing this experiment? Well, his name is 68030. That tells us something about the Nazi perspective on what they're doing and who they're dealing with. Now, time is pretty much done, so I'm going to skip ahead to this last part. And the last part is a perspective on what it was like inside the camp from a Jewish perspective. And I'm looking at Richard Glaser. Richard Glaser was a Jew from Czechoslovakia, from what is today the Czech Republic, who had been deported to Treblinka through the general government of Poland. He managed to survive. He escaped in August of 1943 in the uprising in Treblinka and somehow managed to survive, where most of the escapees were hunted down and killed, either by Germans or by local people. And he was interviewed after the war. And he says in his interview after the war with Gita Sereni, who wrote a book about Treblinka called Into That Darkness that she published in the 1970s, and interviewed the commandant of Treblinka, Stangl, and various other people from Treblinka. And Glaser was one of the people who worked in sorting the goods of the prisoners who had arrived. And he says, things went from bad to worse in that month of March of 1943. There were no transports. In February, just a few, remnants from here and there, and then a few hundred gypsies, and they were really poor. They brought nothing. In the storehouses, everything had been packed up and shipped, that is, shipped to Germany. We'd never before seen all the space because it had always been so full. And suddenly everything, clothing, watches, spectacles, shoes, walking sticks, cooking pots, linen, and not to speak of food, everything went. And one day there was nothing left. You can't imagine what we felt when there was nothing there. You see, the things were our justification for being alive. If there were no things to administer, why would they let us stay alive? And on top of that, we were, for the first time, hungry. We were eating the camp food now, and it was terrible. And of course, it was totally inadequate. That is, in the camp until that point, they were eating food that people had brought with them on the trains. And all those people sent to the gas chambers, but they could use the food that those people had brought. So they actually, in this place of horror and genocide, they actually were eating not so badly until the shelves were empty. So what happened? In the 6 weeks of almost no transports, all of us lost an incredible amount of weight and energy. And many had already succumbed to all kinds of illnesses, especially typhus. It was the strain of anxiety which increased with every day, the lack of food, and the constant fear of the Germans, who appeared to us to be getting as panic-stricken as we were. It was just about when we had reached the lowest ebb in our morale that one day, towards the end of March, Kurt Franz, that's the deputy commandant, walked into our barracks, a wide grin on his face. As of tomorrow, he said, transports will be rolling in again. And you know what we did? We shouted, hurrah, hurrah. And I would say that when we read or hear Richard Glaser talking, because he's also been interviewed on film, we yelled, hurrah, hurrah. There we approach a little bit of an inkling of trying to understand of what was the heart of that darkness, the horror of those camps, and what the prisoners went through when the prisoners shout, hurrah, hurrah, because more prisoners are coming to be killed. Thank you very much.